Okay, hello chess players. Today I'm going to go over probably the most important endgame concept you're ever going to learn, and this applies to pretty much every single endgame that you're ever going to play. It's basically called the two weaknesses principle. It comes up a lot in minor piece endgames like bishop and pawn endgames, but it can also come up in knight versus bishop endgames and all kinds of other endgames. Basically, the idea is that you have to tie your opponent down to two weaknesses in order to have enough to win an endgame. So I've always kind of demonstrated this with the simplest endgame possible. This is a bishop and pawn endgame where black has had the unfortunate situation of having both of his pawns on the wrong color square for his bishop. He's got a light squared bishop, and he's got both of his pawns on light squares, whereas white has a light squared bishop, and both of his pawns are on dark squares. That not only means that black's pawns can get targeted by the white bishop, it also means that white's own pawns are not hindering his own bishop. And that's actually the more critical thing. Whenever you're playing in a bishop endgame, you always want your pawns on the opposite colored squares of your own bishop, regardless of what color your opponent's bishop is. So even in opposite colored endgames, this is something that people will often get wrong. Sometimes they'll put the pawns in the same color square as their bishop because they think they can protect them. So that is not how endgames work at all. Now, winning this endgame from here is actually really simple. The first thing we do is we target this pawn, ideally from behind. And the other reason that we target it from behind is because the ideal square to target both of these pawns is going to be this e8 square. And that's something that's really critical when you're thinking about two weaknesses, is look at a square that's going to target both of these pawns. In this case, there's two options available to us. There's this square right here, and there's this square right here. So we have the e2 square and the e8 square where we can target this pawn. Now, of course, the ideal is going to be behind the pawn, because that gives black the fewest number of defensive options. So if we play bishop d7 and then they have to play bishop a6, and we play bishop e8 and they play king h6, king f2 on its own is already zugzwang. Either the black bishop has to move, in which case the pawn on b5 hangs, or the black king has to move, in which case the pawn on h5 is going to hang. So, for example, king g7. Bishop takes h5, we win this pawn, and then winning this endgame from here is actually kind of academic. Now, there are other scenarios that we can play this endgame from. For example, we could start from this position, and we would play it about the same. We would go behind and attack the h-pawn first, bishop f7, king h6, bishop e8, bishop a6, king f2. It's the exact same zugzwang. Another way that we could see this setup start is we could start with, say, the bishop on b1. Note that in this situation, we don't have a way to get to behind either one of the pawns. We can't get to the d7 square, and we can't get to even the g6 square because the g6 square is covered. Here we would have no problem going after the e2 square, where we can just simply attack both pawns at the same time. But we're not going to create zugzwang with just our bishop anymore. We're going to play bishop to d3, hitting that b5 square. The bishop is going to defend with bishop c6. We're going to have bishop e2, and now both pawns are attacked. King g6, we're going to bring our king to e3, and now we are going to win the game because when this bishop shuffles back and forth, we're simply going to bring our king to attack one of these pawns because both pawns are tied down. The king can't move away because we're capturing the pawn on h5, and of course this pawn on b5 is getting attacked multiple times, and we're going to be able to take that pawn as well. So these types of scenarios become a lot more relevant as we add more pawns on the board. The same concept still works if you have multiple pawns on both sides. If all the pawns are on the wrong color square for black and all the pawns are on the right color square for white, we can use the exact same ideas. We can play bishop f7, king g7, bishop e8, bishop a6, king f2. It's the exact same thing. The addition of a couple extra pawns doesn't make any difference. After king f2, we have zugzwang. Either the bishop or the king has to move, and we're going to win some material. So when we're talking about two weaknesses principle, we have two weaknesses in all of these situations where we have 2 pawns on the board. The question is, what happens when we don't have two weaknesses? What happens when we only have one? And this is a bit of a problem. If you only have one weakness that you can target, it's actually impossible to win. So this is a really good example of that. I can definitely target this single solitary weakness. I can play bishop a4. But unless I can also get my king into the attack as well to attack this pawn, there's no way that I can win the game. Now, simply planting my bishop on the a4 square does pretty much nothing to help my king get in, and as soon as this king plants itself on either f6 or g5, my king is never making progress. But more importantly, the bishop is never going to have to move. It has 2 squares that it can shuffle back and forth between, and once we establish this blockade, there's really no way that I should ever be able to break through. Also, if my king goes in the other direction, this king can just go in the other direction, hold that square, the bishop can shuffle back and forth, no progress can be made. So an example would be, I could try king f2 going after this area, we could have bishop d7, bishop a4, and then simply king f6, king g3, king g5, no progress can be made. I can try shuffling this bishop back around, bishop d1, bishop c8, bishop a4, bishop d7, absolutely nothing is going to happen. So that brings me to my final position, a position where it's kind of, it's a maybe, it's kind of an interesting position. We have the same position where we have this weakness back here, but now we have an additional weakness right here. So now we do have 2 weaknesses. Now this position is a little complicated, because black has some situations where you can create a blockade, where we can't make progress because we can only attack 1 weakness at a time. But there's situations where white can break through and create zugzwang. So this is one of those critical positions where it's really important to know, if you're defending, some of the only positions where white can actually win. And it's also really important to know, if you're attacking, what are your best chances to try to play for a win. So one of the main things to keep in mind is sort of your zugzwang position. If you can get this bishop here, even if your king is blockaded out, like if you can get your king to g3 and f4 and they've blockaded you with king f4. So you get your king to f4, they get their king to f6, etc. Your king is blockaded out of the situation. If you get your bishop to the c8 square, that is zugzwang. Now the reason that is zugzwang is because of the 2 weaknesses principle. So this is kind of interesting. So let's just make some fictional moves here for both sides. Let's say we have our king coming up, king g3, and then we have bishop to g6, we have king f4, king f6. So they've created the blockade, and they've also kept their bishop defending this pawn. So now, if I can magic this bishop to that c8 square, I can actually win the game. I'm going to have a zugzwang situation if I can get the bishop to c8. So let's see why. So I'm going to bring my bishop to a4. They're going to play bishop to e8. And now, if the king gives way at any point, I'm going to play king g5, and then eventually bishop d1, and I will win that pawn. So it's very important to note that we already have 1 weakness that we're eyeballing. We're eyeballing that h5 weakness. So if the king on f6 ever moves, we're going to win. So for example, bishop d7, and let's just make a bad move, king g7, king g5, we win the game easily, no problem. So we're going to have them make a better move. We're going to have them just play something like bishop to g6, and now in this case, we're actually not going to be able to make a whole lot of progress. We can play bishop to e2, bishop f7, bishop back, bishop e6, bishop a6, and then bishop g4 maintains the blockade, and we're not going to be able to win. Notice that the bishop is covering this critical c8 square. We can never quite create zugzwang. We can, of course, attack the pawn chain from behind. We can play bishop b7, but as you can see, nothing is happening here. Black is just holding his pawn. So what would be the critical mistake that black could make? Well, of course, the critical mistake that black could make is if he takes his bishop off of this diagonal when we're ready to take that diagonal. So for an example, we have bishop e6, bishop a6. This is a very critical moment. If black doesn't think that that makes any difference, if he plays something like bishop f7, we're now winning the game with bishop b7, bishop e8, bishop c8, and in this exact position we have zugzwang when the bishop is on c8 and their bishop is on e8. Why? Because of 2 weaknesses principle. We have a weakness on the h5 square, and we can attack that weakness if the black king moves. If this black king moves anywhere, if king g7, we have king g5, and then eventually we wheel the bishop back around, take on h5, and we win. So for example, we could have king g7, king g5, and then we're just going to have bishop to a6, bishop to e2, bishop takes h5, game over. Now another example of what could happen here is they could try something like king g6. Well, now the king will simply travel to e5, and then d6, and then we win that pawn on c6, because there's 2 weaknesses. There's a weakness on c6 and a weakness on h5. So we could try something else. We could try moving our bishop. We could play bishop to g6, but then it's simple. Bishop d7, and we attack the weakness on c6 and we win. So the bishop on c8 is zugzwang. So again, this comes back to understanding the 2 weaknesses principle. Black has a blockade as long as he can prevent white from attacking both weaknesses, and the only way that white can attack both weaknesses is if he gets his bishop to the critical c8 square, where he's threatening to attack the pawn on c6 and also threatening to attack the pawn on h5. If he can only attack one weakness at a time, and he can't force that zugzwang, and black can constantly just shuffle his bishop back and forth, say between d7 and e8, or between d7 and g4, if he keeps his bishop on this diagonal, where it can defend both pawns successfully without ever having to move the king, then black has the blockade, and black has the draw. And anyways, that's two weaknesses principle, that's how it works, and that's how you implement it in some of these complicated bishop and pawn endgames. I hope you found this video helpful, I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.